In 1963, a man walks into an Oldsmobile dealership with enough money to buy almost anything on the lot, and he walks out with a Starfire, a car built to be the fastest, smoothest, most confident thing Oldsmobile had ever put a price tag on. Under that long hood sits an engine so strong that Oldsmobile's own engineers considered it the best V8 the brand had built up to that point. A 394 cubic inch rocket V8 tuned harder than anything wearing an Oldsmobile emblem before it. 6 months later, that same man is standing on the shoulder of a highway with the hood up, staring at a transmission that just quit on him at 40 miles an hour. And he is not thinking about how fast the engine can pull. He is thinking about how he is never buying another Oldsmobile again. That is the entire story of the 1963 Starfire in one sentence. Oldsmobile built one of the greatest engines of the entire decade, and then bolted it to a transmission that quietly destroyed the reputation of everything sitting in front of it. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how a single transmission choice buried one of the most powerful American engines of 1963, and why almost nobody talks about this car the way it deserves to be talked about. Let's go back to where this actually starts, because the Starfire wasn't some afterthought model thrown together to fill a gap in the lineup. Oldsmobile launched the Starfire in 1961 as a personal luxury coupe, something meant to compete directly with the Ford Thunderbird, a car for buyers who wanted power and prestige in the same package. Not a stripped-down economy sedan, and not a stiff business like Cadillac either. This was supposed to be Oldsmobile's statement car, the one that told the entire industry that Oldsmobile could build something genuinely exciting instead of just comfortable. By 1963, Oldsmobile had refined that formula for 3 straight years, and the engineering team had one clear goal for the Starfire's engine: make it hit harder than anything else in Oldsmobile's own catalog. Because if this car couldn't outrun a Thunderbird, there was no reason for it to exist at all. So they went to the 394 cubic inch rocket V8, an engine Oldsmobile had already been developing and improving since the late 1950s. And for the Starfire, they pushed it further than they ever had before. The 1963 Starfire's Rocket 394 carried a 4-barrel carburetor, a higher compression ratio than the standard Oldsmobile lineup, and a factory horsepower rating of 345, at a time when most family sedans on American roads were making somewhere between 150 and 200 horsepower. Torque numbers sat close to 440 pound-feet, which meant this engine wasn't just fast on paper. It had the kind of low-end shove that made a 2-ton personal luxury coupe feel like it was being launched off the line, rather than accelerating normally. Automotive writers at the time genuinely respected this engine. It wasn't dismissed as a marketing gimmick or an underpowered showpiece. Multiple period road tests praised the 394 for being one of the strongest, smoothest performing V8s Oldsmobile had ever released. And some Oldsmobile engineers themselves would later describe this exact version of the Rocket 394 as the high point of the engine's development, before the entire Rocket family got replaced by Oldsmobile's later big block engines in the mid-1960s. Read that again. The engineers who built it, the same people who had access to every version of this engine across its entire production run, pointed at this one, the 1963 Starfire's Rocket 394, and said that's the best one we ever made. That is not a small compliment. That is an entire engineering team telling you they nailed it. And for a moment, on paper, everything about this car made sense. You had a genuinely powerful, well-engineered engine wrapped in a luxury coupe body with bucket seats, a center console, styling that looked expensive without looking flashy, and a badge that told everyone parked next to you that this wasn't some cheap commuter car. The Starfire should have been remembered as one of the defining American performance luxury cars of the early 1960s. It should be sitting in the same conversation as the Thunderbird, the Grand Prix, the Riviera that came a year later. Instead, ask most classic car enthusiasts today what they know about the 1963 Starfire, and you'll get a shrug, or at best a vague mention that it had transmission problems. That's it. That's the entire legacy, reduced to a footnote about a gearbox. And once you understand what Oldsmobile paired with that Rocket 394, you'll understand exactly why. Here's where the story turns, and this is the part almost nobody explains properly. Oldsmobile didn't send the 1963 Starfire out with a brand new purpose, built transmission designed to handle 345 horsepower and 440 pound-feet of torque. They used the Roto Hydra-Matic, a transmission General Motors had introduced back in 1961, as a lighter, cheaper, more compact replacement for the older, heavier dual-coupling Hydra-Matic units that Oldsmobile and Cadillac had relied on through the 1950s. On paper, the Roto Hydra-Matic sounded like progress. It was smaller, it weighed less, it was cheaper to manufacture at scale across multiple GM divisions, and General Motors pushed it out to Oldsmobile, Pontiac, and even Cadillac around the same era to standardize production and cut costs. But here's the problem. Nobody in the marketing department wanted to talk about out loud. This transmission had a well-documented reputation, even in period, for harsh, sometimes violent shifts between gears, and more importantly, for struggling to handle sustained high torque loads over time. It wasn't built with the same margin of durability as the transmissions it replaced, and it definitely wasn't built with a 345 horsepower rocket vate in mind when the engineering specs were first drawn up. Think about what that actually means in practice. You've got a customer who paid a premium price for a luxury coupe specifically because the brochure promised him a genuinely fast, genuinely powerful car. He puts his foot down, expecting that Rocket 394 to deliver everything the engineers built into it. And the transmission underneath him is the weak link in that entire chain, translating raw horsepower into shifts that lurch, hesitate, or in worse cases, fail outright under repeated hard use. Every time that engine tried to prove itself, the transmission behind it was the thing standing in the way. It's like handing someone a world-class sprinter and then putting him in shoes 2 sizes too small and telling him to go set a record. The talent was there. The execution around it wasn't. And here's the part that makes this genuinely sting when you think about it. This wasn't some hidden defect buried deep in an obscure trim level nobody bought. This was the standard pairing on a flagship performance luxury car that Oldsmobile was actively trying to sell as a Thunderbird rival. The exact buyers most likely to push that engine hard, the ones who wanted to feel every bit of that 345 horsepower rating, were the exact buyers most likely to expose every weakness in that transmission. Now stay with me here, because if you think this is just internet legend or modern nostalgia exaggerating an old car's flaws, the complaints about this exact transmission go back to when these cars were still under warranty, not decades later in some online forum. Owners across multiple GM divisions using the Roto Hydra-Matic in this era reported rough, sometimes jarring shifts, and dealerships saw a real pattern of transmission-related service visits that went well beyond ordinary wear and tear complaints. This wasn't isolated to Oldsmobile either, but Oldsmobile felt it harder because the Starfire's engine was pushing more power through that same basic transmission architecture than a lot of the other cars using it. General Motors themselves eventually read the writing on the wall. By 1964, GM had already begun transitioning away from the Roto Hydra-Matic across its divisions, moving toward the Turbo Hydra-Matic 400, a transmission that would go on to become one of the most respected, most durable automatic transmissions GM ever produced, used for decades afterward, in everything from luxury cars to trucks. Read into that timing for a second. The very next major transmission GM rolled out became a legend for reliability. The one it replaced barely lasted a few years in frontline use before GM itself moved on from it. That's not a coincidence. That's an admission, even if nobody at General Motors ever said it directly in a press release. So picture the ripple effect this created for the Starfire specifically. A buyer walks into a dealership in 1963, gets sold on the idea of an Oldsmobile that can genuinely compete with a Thunderbird, drives off the lot, thrilled with how the Rocket 394 pulls, and within a year or two starts running into transmission issues that require dealership visits, repairs, and in some cases, full transmission replacement. Word of mouth in that era traveled slower than it does today, but it still traveled. Neighbors talked, coworkers compared notes on their new cars in parking lots. And when the story that spreads about your flagship performance coupe is great engine, but the transmission gave out on me, that story sticks harder than any advertisement Oldsmobile ever ran. You can build the best engine in your company's history, and if the car wrapped around it develops a reputation for leaving people stranded, the engine's greatness becomes a footnote in its own car's story. And this is exactly what happened. Search for information on the 1963 Starfire today, and the Rocket 394 barely gets mentioned on its own merits. It gets mentioned as the engine in the Starfire that had transmission problems. An engine that Oldsmobile's own people considered a genuine high point for the Rocket family got permanently linked, in almost every historical write-up, to the weakest component sitting right behind it. That's the tragedy hiding inside this story. It's not that Oldsmobile built a bad car, it's that Oldsmobile built one exceptional part and one mediocre part, put them in the same chassis, and let the mediocre part define the whole car's legacy for the next 60 years. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Because this isn't just a story about one bad transmission choice, it's a story about how badly timed engineering decisions inside a massive company like General Motors can quietly sabotage a genuinely great product. Remember, the Roto Hydra-Matic wasn't designed in isolation for the Starfire. It was a cost-cutting, weight-saving decision made at the General Motors corporate level, rolled out across multiple divisions to simplify manufacturing and reduce parts complexity. Oldsmobile's engine team was building one of the best V8s in company history. At the exact same time, General Motors, as a whole, was making a transmission decision that would undercut it. Two different teams, two different priorities, and nobody connecting the dots on how those two decisions would interact once they landed in the same car in a customer's driveway. That's the real lesson buried in this story. And it's one that still applies to companies today. You can have brilliant engineers working on one piece of a product and equally competent engineers working on another piece. And if those two pieces aren't built with each other in mind, the whole product suffers, no matter how good either piece is individually. If you're thinking this all sounds like it must have tanked Starfire sales completely, the actual sales story is a little more complicated than that. And honestly, that makes it a more interesting mystery, not a less interesting one. The Starfire nameplate continued through the 1966 model year before Oldsmobile discontinued it, and the car did sell in reasonable numbers throughout its run, which tells you the transmission problems weren't severe enough or widespread enough to completely kill the model in the short term. But the model's long-term reputation is a different story entirely from its short-term sales figures. Plenty of cars sell fine in period and still end up remembered decades later as flawed or troubled, once enough owners compare notes over the years. That's exactly what happened here. The Starfire sold reasonably well while it was new, and then slowly, as more owners hit that transmission's limits over months and years of ownership, the reputation caught up with the car, and by the time collectors started looking back at early 1960s, American performance cars decades later, the Starfire had already been quietly filed under the one with transmission problems instead of the one with the incredible engine. Now let's talk about what this actually looks like today, because this is where the story gets almost poetic in how thoroughly it flips the original problem on its head. If you go looking for a surviving 1963 Starfire in the collector car world right now, you will find something that would have been unthinkable to that original 1963 buyer standing on the side of the highway. A meaningful number of surviving Starfires on the road today are not running their original Roto Hydra-Matic transmission at all. Collectors and restorers over the decades have swapped in stronger, more durable transmissions, in some cases the very turbo Hydra-Matic that replaced the Roto Hydra-Matic in GM's own lineup just 1 year later, specifically because they want to actually experience what that Rocket 394 is capable of without worrying about the exact same failure that plagued original owners. Think about what that means. 60 years later, people who genuinely love this car have to modify it, have to remove a factory original part, just to let the engine do what Oldsmobile's engineers originally built it to do. The fix for one of Oldsmobile's best engines wasn't found by Oldsmobile. It was found decades later by private owners who refused to let a bad transmission keep burying a great engine. And if you want the most quietly brutal detail in this entire story, here it is. Because so many original Starfires either had their transmissions replaced over the decades or simply didn't survive daily use with the factory Roto Hydra-Matic still intact and functioning, genuinely original, numbers matching 1963 Starfires with their factory transmission still in place and still working correctly are noticeably harder to find today than you'd expect for a car built in respectable numbers during a boom era for American car production. The very flaw that hurt this car's reputation in period is the same reason unmolested original examples are rarer today. Because the parts most likely to fail were the parts most likely to eventually get replaced one way or another, by an owner somewhere along the way. A weakness in 1963 turned into a rarity factor in the present day, which is exactly the kind of twist that makes automotive history endlessly fascinating if you actually dig into it, instead of just repeating the same old summary everyone else repeats. Before we get to that question, let's slow down for a second, because there's one more layer to this story that most people skip right past. And it's the layer that actually explains why this problem hit the Starfire harder than it hit some of its GM siblings using the exact same transmission family. It comes down to weight and intent. the Starfire wasn't a light car. It was built as a full-sized personal luxury coupe, loaded with power windows, power seats, a heavier body structure, and all the comfort features Oldsmobile crammed in to justify its price tag against the Thunderbird. A heavier car paired with one of the strongest engines in the entire Oldsmobile lineup, sitting on a transmission that was already considered a weight and cost-saving compromise rather than a heavy-duty unit, is close to the worst possible combination you could design if durability was the goal. Compare that to a lighter car using a milder version of the same basic transmission family, and you can see why the Starfire absorbed more of this reputation than some of its GM relatives did. It wasn't just that the transmission had a weakness. It's that the Starfire specifically combined every factor that exposed that weakness at once: heavy car, strong engine, hard-driving buyers who wanted to feel that horsepower rating, all funneling straight through the one component that couldn't fully handle it. And here's something that tends to surprise people when they hear it for the first time. Some period reviewers, the same writers who praised the Rocket 394's power and smoothness, quietly flagged concerns about how the transmission behaved under hard acceleration, describing shift behavior that ranged from firm to outright harsh depending on the specific car and how it had been driven and maintained. That's a remarkable thing to have on record from the same era the car was new, not something invented decades later by online forums looking to tear down a classic. When professional automotive journalists, writing gushing praise about an engine in one paragraph, pause in the next paragraph to gently flag concerns about the transmission underneath it, that tells you the problem wasn't subtle, and it wasn't something only unlucky owners with bad luck cars happened to run into. It was baked into the pairing itself. Now, if you're starting to think this sounds like classic corporate short-sightedness, you're exactly right. And here's the part that makes it sting even more. Once you zoom out to the bigger picture happening across Detroit at the same time. The early 1960s was an era when American automakers were locked in a horsepower arms race, each brand trying to outmuscle the others under the hood, while at the exact same time trying to cut costs everywhere else in the car to keep prices competitive. Engines got all the glory, all the marketing attention, all the magazine cover space, while transmissions, brakes, and suspension components quietly became the place where manufacturers looked to save money and simplify manufacturing. Oldsmobile wasn't uniquely careless here. They were doing exactly what the entire industry was doing in that era, chasing the horsepower number that would sell brochures, while treating the transmission as a solved problem that didn't need the same obsessive attention. The Starfire just happened to be the specific car where that industry-wide blind spot collided hardest with genuinely excellent engine engineering, which is exactly why this story is worth telling on its own, instead of getting lumped in with every other old car had reliability issues story you've heard 100 times before. Stay with me because there's one more twist coming, and it's the one that ties this entire story together in a way you probably haven't heard before. If you've made it this far, you already understand the engine was great, and the transmission was the problem. But the next part explains why this specific combination became almost a case study among people who restore and study these cars closely, and it's about to make you look at every one of these old personal luxury coupes a little differently. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If Oldsmobile had simply paired that same 1963 Rocket 394, the same engine their own engineers considered the best version of that Vate family, with a transmission actually built to handle its output, where would the Starfire sit in automotive history today? Would it be mentioned in the same breath as the Thunderbird and the Grand Prix, the way it was originally designed to compete? Would collectors be chasing numbers matching originals the way they chase early Mustangs and Camaros, instead of quietly swapping transmissions just to enjoy the engine safely? We'll never actually know the answer, because General Motors made a corporate-level transmission decision in 1961 that had nothing to do with the Starfire specifically, and that single decision ended up defining how an entire generation of car enthusiasts would remember one of Oldsmobile's genuinely great engines. One transmission choice, made for cost and weight reasons that had nothing to do with performance, quietly buried the reputation of an engine that Oldsmobile's own people were proud enough of to call it their best. That's the story of the 1963 Oldsmobile Starfire, a car built around one of the finest engines Oldsmobile ever produced. Undone, not by bad design, not by bad intentions, and not by a lack of engineering talent, but by a single transmission decision made somewhere else in the company that nobody thought would matter this much. Next time you come across an old Starfire sitting quietly in a garage or a classic car show, Don't just glance at the badge and move on. Pop the hood. And remember, you're looking at an engine that deserved a legacy it never fully got to have because of the one part sitting right behind it. If this kind of story is exactly the reason you watch these videos, drop a like. And let me know down in the comments if you've ever seen a genuine surviving 1963 Starfire in person. Because honestly, they are rarer than most people realize.